Warning: the content of these videos contains adult themes which may be distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Everything you are about to hear is taken from court documents, trial transcripts and various media sources. Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime with Mystery Maverick. Over the last 4 episodes, I have taken you inside the case files and the courtroom in the murder case of 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe. We have looked at the circumstances surrounding Stephanie's murder and the various characters entwined in the long search for answers and justice. Today I will critically evaluate the evidence collection and forensic procedures utilised in the case. I will give my opinion as I lay out the offender risk factors in relation to both the boys and Richard Tuitt and the probabilities relating to their involvement in the crime. I will summarise my research findings and share questions that arose, mistakes I believe that were made, and ultimately lessons to be learnt. As we come to the conclusion in the mystery, who killed Stephanie Crowe? I am not diagnosing anyone with a mental illness, and I will only mention where actual certified diagnosis has been given. This has no legal standing, and anyone mentioned is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. In recent years, courts have come to view eyewitness testimony as unreliable or biased. Physical evidence such as DNA, fingerprints and trace evidence may independently and objectively link a suspect or victim to a crime, disprove an alibi, or develop important investigative leads. Physical evidence may also prove invaluable for exonerating the innocent. Since the role of physical evidence plays a huge part in the criminal justice system, the recognition, collection, preservation and analysis of the evidence must be properly maintained. Without the proper handling and processing of evidence, the forensic value of the evidence can be diminished or inadmissible in court. Evidence collection is the foundation of any crime scene investigation. The scene needs to be secured, photographed, evidence collected, witnesses and suspects interviewed, and ultimately the crime reconstructed. The Escondido PD were by no means strangers to violent crime, and the department was well resourced, even having their own evidence section. They were pretty quickly able to secure the crime scene and interview possible witnesses and suspects. The crime scene evidence report is detailed and contains the movements and assignments of CSO and police, the evidence that was collected, along with evidence tags and photo exhibits. At any crime scene, the crime scene investigator must make an effort to collect the evidence that is going to provide the most useful information in establishing the facts about the case. An investigator must recognise and have the ability to identify probative evidence scattered among potentially vast quantities of redundant, irrelevant or unrelated items. For instance, collecting 20 bloodstains from the vicinity of a stabbing victim may not point to the perpetrator. The recognition process involves basic forensic principles such as pattern recognition and analysis, and physical properties observation. If crucial evidence is not recognised, collected and preserved, it may be lost forever. Therefore, an experienced investigator who systematically evaluates the crime scene is invaluable. One of the first things I look at when evaluating evidence collection is the type and volume of evidence collected and its probative value in relation to the crime scene. By looking at what was collected, along with court testimony and evidence reports, we can clearly see the symptoms of confirmation bias. This is the psychological process where a person collects evidence to confirm their theory, whilst excluding other evidence that does not. By studying the police reports and the evidence collection processes in the crime scene report, we see why this bias may have occurred. Although many items were collected, the evidence collection process seems undirected and in some parts erroneous. Although crime scene officers collected over 280 items of evidence, they ultimately found none of any forensic value. Officers testified that they believed early on that someone in the house had committed the crime, and pretty quickly settled on Michael as the culprit. This is evident in the fact that a substantial number of items were collected from Michael's room, which consisted of books, magazines and computer games. Investigators' theories were based on behavioural observations of the teen in the hours after his sister's murder. However, there were no visible signs of blood in or around Michael's room. Besides inflammatory evidence of the fantasy writings of a young teenage boy about a mystic character, there was no physical evidence connecting Michael to the crime. CSO testified that Michael's room was messy and full of dirty dishes, so there was no evidence a clean-up had occurred prior to the police arrival. Therefore, focusing on this evidence was counterintuitive to the investigation, as not only did it add doubt to their theory, it did little to support it either. Regardless, investigators pressed on with the investigation against Michael and were not being guided by the crime scene evidence, but by what they would refer to as gut instinct. In the same vein, investigators believed that Michael had picked Stephanie up from her bed and moved her onto the floor. Uncoincidentally, most of the blood swabs taken from the crime scene were directly from around Stephanie's body. Subsequent analysis of the crime scene and re-evaluation of the autopsy reports has shown that Stephanie was likely attacked as she lay in her bed, and all of Stephanie's wounds were inflicted as she struggled underneath her comforter. This means that her attacker most likely had physical contact with the comforter and not Stephanie herself. Thus, the comforter in this case would be of probative value for biological samples in that it may provide a possible link to the perpetrator. Often, in close contact cases such as knife attacks, suspects can cut themselves in the process. Although the comforter was collected and examined for tool analysis in comparison to the knife, I found no evidence that the blood samples were ever taken from Stephanie's comforter or tested for DNA. We know that Stephanie was already mortally wounded as she tried to get up and crawl to the door in an effort to get help. CSO took part of the wall from Stephanie's bedroom that had blood on it. Again, this evidence is erroneous. If Stephanie had touched the bottom of the wall as she had attempted to open her bedroom door. It is likely that this evidence only confirms that fact, and is very unlikely to identify and/or link a suspect to the crime scene. Fingerprints were lifted from several external doors and internal doors in the home. However, prints were not taken from the drawer on Stephanie's bedroom floor. Stephen Crowe stated in one of his police interviews that Stephanie's drawer was not turned out on the floor the evening before. It is vital to have a clear system of communication between investigators and crime scene officers. This is so that important evidence is not overlooked and investigators can guide the crime scene officers should new information or suspects arise during the search. Investigators in the case did not communicate with crime scene officers regarding the developing information on Richard Tuitt. his subsequent questioning and the evidence of the cut on his palm. This could have directed the investigation to collect prints from the drawer, as they would essentially be looking for signs of an intruder. Had they known about the cut on Richard's hand and not resigned themselves to the idea of Stephanie being moved, would they have taken swabs and utilised further tests on Stephanie's comforters? Unfortunately, we will never know. What is clear is that evidence collection was focused in the wrong direction due to the preconceived biases held by investigators. Had a systematic and objective analysis of the crime scene been carried out, there may well have been evidence put into it in Stephanie's room and inside the Crowe home the night of her murder. DNA in many ways has become the gold standard of forensic science in courtrooms around the world. Not only has DNA been used to convict the guilty, but in more recent years to exonerate the innocent. DNA testing has significantly advanced in recent years, becoming far more automated and more sensitive to smaller samples with the implementation of mitochondrial DNA sequencing in the forensic arena. Additionally, with the advent of DNA databases, it has become an even more effective tool for the criminal justice system. However, mitochondrial DNA analysis does not have the ability to distinguish between siblings. Mitochondria consists of DNA from the maternal lineage and is inherited from mother to her offspring. Therefore, siblings born to the same mother are indistinguishable. George Durgan's report shows that the DNA that was collected from around Stephanie's body was indistinguishable from Michael's. They presented this in a way to indicate Michael's possible involvement. However, further tests would have been needed to show that it was Michael's and not Stephanie's own blood. DNA tests were also carried out on knives confiscated from the Treadway home, and both knives revealed no evidence of blood present. As they were certain this was their murder weapon, they failed to test the knife earlier found by Detective Han, which further shows they were looking in the wrong direction. There is also the question of why Tuitt's clothes were not thoroughly tested at the time of collection. The day Tuitt was picked up, he had already been wandering around in the rain in a hot climate. Exposure to the elements can cause potential problems for the DNA analysts and can contribute to false negative results. Police did not consider Tuitt seriously as a suspect for several reasons. They had already come to the conclusion that the crime was planned and premeditated, so they thought him incapable of committing the crime unnoticed. They further believed by this time that Michael was the perpetrator and he had been helped by his friends. I believe that it's for this reason that they tested the best defense knife and items from Michael's room but didn't test Tuitt's white shirt until months later. We know that the boys were declared factually innocent by a judge, which is no mean feat, as pointed out by one of my viewers recently. However, in these cases, the wrongfully accused and convicted never completely feel exonerated in the court of public opinion. Despite the judge's ruling, there are still people to this day on social media and even investigators such as Chris McDonough who continue to cast suspicion and doubt on the boys' involvement. Drawing from scientific theory and literature on violent crime and violent recidivism, I will outline the risk factors for violence and assess these factors in relation to the available information on the boys and Richard Tuitt. This is not intended to be a comprehensive risk or clinical assessment, as far more detailed personal and medical information is needed for such a task. Violence is a huge public health crisis, and violent crime has a significant economic and social cost to society, as well as a direct psychological cost to the victims. As a result, it has gained much attention from academics across a wide range of disciplines. Widely accepted that violence and aggression are evolved human strategies with a directed goal. Thus, it is a behaviour that people are interested in understanding both academically and theologically. Psychologists have been able to utilise this large body of research to devise a number of risk assessment tools that can not only help minimise the harm of violence, but can be useful when devising treatment and rehabilitative programs to minimise the risk of harm to society. A number of social, individual, psychological and biological risk factors have been identified in relation to violent crime. The term risk factors refers to the set of individual, social or environmental factors that can facilitate and increase the likelihood of developing emotional or behavioural disorders such as criminal behaviour. This is based on the assumption that there are external and internal predispositions in the etiology of criminal behaviour. These risk factors can be further distinguished in terms of static and dynamic, meaning that there are some static risk factors that remain the same over time, such as family background, age, gender and childhood abuse, whereas some dynamic risk factors that can change, such as unemployment, peer influences, drug use, psychiatric symptoms and criminal activity. Alternatively, some researchers have focused on looking at the role of protective factors that can decrease or negate the risk of violent crime. A protective factor is any factor that reduces the probability of offending despite the presence of risk factors. The best predictor of future behaviour remains past behaviour, and this has also been found true for violence. None of the boys had past convictions or cautions for any type of criminal offence, and there are no records they had any emotional or behavioural issues besides the usual teenage rebellion. Stuart was in trouble with the police from as young as 14, and by the time he was 21 he had been arrested a number of times for drug abuse and theft. In 1990, Stuart was arrested for car theft, evading officers and reckless driving. One of the most observable disparities in relation to violent behaviour is gender. It is generally accepted that men are largely more violent than women. This has been shown across cultures exceeded only by psychological and non-physical aggression. This has been shown across cultures exceeded only by psychological and non-physical aggression. In addition, males are more likely to be the victims of violent crime across all types of violence, excluding only sexual and domestic violence. The most prevalent risk factor in violent offending is the age-related demographic. Studies have shown that violent offending peaks in late teens with a steady decline as age rises. Having said that, the types of offences are generally committed towards peers or strangers rather than family members, and again they are also the group most likely to become victims of violent crime. This does not explain violent recidivism and violent offending in the adult population. Age and gender alone are not great predictors of violence, as many male teens do not participate in violent or criminal behaviour. Juveniles who do commit violent criminal offences will have a large range of other predispositions that contribute to the violent behaviour. Research has further shown that the more risk factors an offender has, the higher likelihood of future offending. Several other risk factors which are found to be predicted of later violence in a number of studies included low family income, large family size, low IQ, poor parenting practices, and early aggression and behavioural problems. And having a parent with previous convictions was also found to be one of the strongest predictors of adult convictions. There is no record of any of the boys having dysfunctional family lives, and even though the prosecution tried to insinuate that dirty dishes in a teenage boy's room was evidence of this, there is no factual basis for this assumption. All the boys were intelligent in their own right and did well at school. Besides some missed assignments as previously mentioned by Michael, there were no signs of disruption or aggression either in school or in the home. On a 48 Hours interview, Aaron stated, quote, "The most trouble I've ever been in before this was being late to class." There are no records of any of the boys' parents being convicted of any criminal offence. The prosecution tried to frame Aaron's intelligence as a cause for concern. However, researchers have suggested that an above-average IQ serves as a protective factor for some individuals. On the other hand, Richard grew up with his father until he left school. He had to repeat 7th grade and would skip school and escape to the local beach. His parents divorced when he was 15 and Richard's mother had disappeared straight after. There is no record Richard suffered from any kind of childhood abuse, and he is reported as saying he had a great childhood. Having said that, childhood abandonment plays a key role in later emotional and social development. This feeling of abandonment could have had a significant impact on Richard's vulnerable teenage brain. It most likely framed many of his future interactions with others, increasing his sense of isolation and mistrust of them. Moreover, it may have contributed to Richard's later addictions to drugs and alcohol. Again, Richard was in contact with authorities from a young age, suggesting that he had a lack of parental supervision and support unlike the boys. Another highly debated and controversial risk factor for violence is the presence of a psychiatric disorder. Media portrayals of mental illness and violence are often cherry-picked to contain the most gruesome and sensational events to feed into the public consciousness. This has led to the unsubstantiated idea that schizophrenics are of particular risk of violence and a general danger to society. Thus, a large body of literature exists on risk factors for violence and mental disorders. In reality, there is no direct correlation between schizophrenia and violent offending. This is to say that people with schizophrenia are no more likely to be violent than you or I. In fact, the symptoms of their illness often lead to social exclusion and bullying, making them often the victims of violent crime. The factors of violence are far more prominent than mental illness itself. So the social factors such as deprivation, economic deprivation, availability of firearms, of alcohol and substance misuse are far more useful predictors of explaining higher rates of violence in our population. Therefore, when we look at samples of schizophrenics that are violent, they have many of the same risk factors as other violent offenders. However, by virtue of the illness they have, they can become violent under certain circumstances, the most common of which is substance abuse and untreated symptoms of active psychosis and delusion. Symptoms of paranoid delusions and hallucinations often create a false sense of danger or threat, and other people with no relation to them are perceived as wanting to hurt them, as insulting them or demeaning them, and wanting to do bad things to them. This may cause them to carry out a serious violent offence at the behest of their psychotic symptoms. Tuitt had gone through a number of psychological assessments. Dr. Richard Murphy reported that there was significant evidence of psychosis present. Another report by Dr. Judith Foucault stated that Richard showed evidence of auditory and visual hallucinations, and that Tuitt was severely psychotic and had been for years. He was later diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, but not considered as a danger to others. It is reported that Richard's family had him sectioned over 30 times, and he would be released back into society without additional support or treatment. There is no evidence or records of the boys suffering from any kind of mental illness. All the boys did well at school and had no emotional or behavioural instability noticed by teachers or peers. Media effects research has further looked at the role of violent video games as a risk factor for violent crime. The prosecution inferred that the boys' love of violent video games was the major precipitating factor in the crime. Again, there is no scientific or factual basis for this assertion. Like mental illness, people who play violent video games are no more violent than anyone else. However, like other risk factors, the effects can be greater in conjunction with other more prevalent risk factors for violence. Although you may argue that the boys did play violent or combat-style games, they had no other risk factors besides age and gender. In recent years, academics and researchers have become particularly interested in the role of individual differences and personality traits in predicting violent crime. On this basis, tools such as the world-renowned psychopathy checklist devised by Robert Hare is often used in the assessment of violent offenders. This is to say that a number of personality traits can predispose a person to violent crime. Whilst in police custody, a psychologist, Dr. Bloom, acted as an advisory to the police on the boys' behaviours. Dr. Bloom, having watched a video of Aaron's interview, came to the conclusion that Aaron was a psychopath. His conclusions were based on subjective reasoning and highly unethical in terms of a psychiatric diagnosis. A psychiatric assessment was never carried out on Aaron, and therefore no evidence of psychopathy. In terms of Tuitt, it is most likely that he lacks the mental capacity and calculation to be a psychopath in any true sense of the word. Based on extensive research in the case and taking the evidence into account in its entirety, I believe the jury in Tuitt's first trial got it right. The proximity of Tuitt to the crime that night and timeline that, in my opinion, made it unlikely the boys were even in the vicinity of the crime. The witness accounts of sightings of Tuitt suggest that he was in active psychotic and delusional state at the time of the crime. Richard was homeless at the time and was untreated and under the influence of methamphetamines, which is evident in his arrest records. I believe Richard was mad at Tracy, and one report just days after Stephanie's murder states that he was standing in a parking lot shouting, "Tracy, you fucking bitch, you'd better never do it again." In addition, several other reports from psychiatric institutions had confirmed Tuitt's obsession and fixation with Tracy. Tracy, coincidentally or not, looked strikingly similar to Stephanie Crowe. The evidence suggests that Stephanie was murdered in a blitz attack that was sudden in nature. As there was no evidence of self-defense and no evidence of interaction, either sexual or otherwise, which indicates the crime was committed by an unknown and disorganized offender. In a similar vein, there was no attempt to cover up or conceal the crime, and thus there is no evidence of planning or premeditation, as the original prosecutors implied. I strongly believe that the police and investigators' failure to recognise Tuitt as a viable suspect early on hindered the evidence collection process, and this bias inevitably contributed to the lack of evidence of Tuitt at the crime scene. Tuitt had taken several items from in and around the Crowe home, and ultimately Stephanie's DNA was found on 2 items of his clothing. I believe this placed him at the crime scene the night of the crime, despite the lack of evidence found of him at the Crowe home. In addition, the bloodstains on Richard's shirt were analysed, indicating they were indeed from cast-off and not via transfer. All of this combined with Tuitt's illness, previous criminal and violent history, and substance misuse issues, leads me to believe Richard Tuitt killed Stephanie Crowe. Many avoidable issues occurred in this case, which when highlighted can be used to improve practices within law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Perhaps the most disheartening reality in this case is that there was ultimately no justice in the end for Stephanie Crowe. The litany of failures and biases by investigators meant that vital evidence was lost and/or dismissed early on. The investigators' reliance on hunches instead of systematically analysing the facts meant that they were unable to be flexible on their theory of the crime. This suggests that they had a lack of real knowledge or understanding of violent crime. It is my opinion that it would be advantageous for investigators to have an in-depth knowledge and training in the etiology of violent crime. This, in conjunction with the practice of working theories, may help minimise tunnel vision and the risk of wrongful convictions. Had Tuitt been receiving medical treatment at the time, this incident may never have occurred. This raises the question about the insufficiency and lack of resources provided for the treatment of offenders with serious mental illness. Identified risks for violence suggest a complex picture when it comes to the likelihood of violent offending. Therefore, predicting violent behaviour is an arduous and ultimately impossible task, and also raises questions of people's human and civil rights. What is helpful is using these tools in a way to identify these risks in relation to offender rehabilitation and treatment programs. Moreover, it is clear that there is not only a need for ongoing care in the community, but a range of medical treatments along with social or psychiatric interventions and a multi-agency approach to violent offending in both prison and psychiatric populations. Another issue that arose was the boys' confessions, which we know by now were coerced. Not only did the tactics used against the boys create the perfect environment for a false confession, the actual confessions themselves contained no information that related to the crime. Therefore, in cases where approaches such as the Reed technique are used, investigators should always try to verify the confession with the known facts of the case and the crime scene. This would help limit the number of false confessions and save time and money to the judicial system and the wider community. Once you are convicted of a crime, it is very difficult to prove your innocence, which in recent years has also come with costly consequences for many states in the form of reparation, not to mention the innocent people whose lives are ruined and years lost paying for a crime they didn't commit. I'd like to thank you all for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on who killed Stephanie Crowe, and I look forward to seeing you on the next series of True Crime with Mystery Maverick. Coming soon, a 26-year-old mystery. A doting mother and her two beautiful young boys attacked in the dead of night. A story of unimaginable tragedy. The murder of two precious boys compounded by their innocent mother railroaded by police and sentenced to death. I take you beyond the headlines and inside the case files and the courtroom of the Routier murders. I will present and analyse the evidence and facts of the case like you have never seen them before. A failed investigation, a contaminated crime scene, fabricated evidence, junk science, character assassination, prosecutorial misconduct, and a killer roaming free. With a live episode and special guests close to the case and close to Dali, join me as we delve into the mystery, dying for justice, the wrongful conviction of Dali Routier.